Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 3, 3.1, which was Intro to Cells and the Cell Theory. So we're going to start with the first thing. Who was the gentleman that looked at a piece of cork and discovered cells? Hooke, Robert Hooke. That's the only one you remember? So he discovered cells. Who was the gentleman that looked at some pond water and discovered little unicellular organisms swimming around? Who? No. No. Discovered little unicellular organisms swimming around in a drop of pond water. Leeuwenhoek. So pond water and discovered little unicellular, single-celled organisms. Okay? Who was the gentleman that discovered that all parts of an animal were made out of cells? Schwann. Okay, so then who discovered that plants were made out of cells? Who discovered that plants were made out of cells? With Schwann for animals and Sladen. Yep, another S. Sladen. So plants made of cells. And then this last guy, Virchow. What did he discover?
All cells come from existing.
Very good. All cells come from existing cells. All right. These Schwann and Virchow, they helped us formulate this theory. What was that theory called? The cell theory. And it has 3 parts. What are the 3 parts of the cell theory?
All cells come from existing cells.
You got it. All cells come from pre-existing cells. Very good. Cells are the basic unit of life, so all cells come from existing cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. And one other thing.
All living things are made out of one or more.
You got it. So cells are basic unit of structure and function. And all cells or all organisms are made up of one or more cells. There we go. So there's our cell theory. All living things are made out of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. And all cells come from existing cells or pre-existing cells. Now, once they formulated the cell theory, they got rid of that thing called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation was a theory that living things came from non-living sources. Okay. All right, moving on from there. We talked about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Those are the 2 categories that all cells belong to. So I'm going to put here prokaryotes. I'm going to put here both and eukaryotes. Okay. So if we're talking about prokaryotes, both, or eukaryotes, you had to do an activity that you had to choose different parts and decide if it belonged to prokaryote, eukaryote, or both. So let me ask you this. Which type of cell has DNA? Both. Which type of cell is smaller? Prokaryotes. So this one's smaller, this one's bigger. So I'll put that over here. Okay. So if they both have DNA, what was the shape of a prokaryote's DNA? A circle. So a single circular loop. So they have circular DNA, or I'll say loop of DNA. And then what was the shape of the eukaryote's DNA? Rectangle, rod shaped. So it goes straight up and down. Like a, and this is just a single circular loop of DNA. Okay. Which type of cell has ribosomes?
Eukaryote.
Both. Tried to trick you. Ribosomes. Which one has membrane-bound organelles? Eukaryotes. Membrane-bound organelles. So then this one has no membrane-bound organelles. Which one encloses their DNA in a nucleus? So they have a nucleus. Eukaryotes. So eukaryotes have it. Prokaryotes, no nucleus. Have nucleus. Which one is more simple looking, pro or eu? Pro. So this other one is more complex looking. Which one has a cell membrane? Both. Which one, or let me ask you it this way. What is an example of a prokaryotic cell? Bacteria. So then what is an example of a eukaryotic cell? Animal cells, what else? Plants? Anything else you can think of? Yep, plants. These things called protists, and also fungus. Okay. Now, which one has cytoplasm? The jelly-like fluid? Both. Okay, so there's a list of criteria for both prokaryote, eukaryote, or both. You guys remember that stuff? From there, we started to talk about eukaryotic cell organelles, right? So the parts of the cell. I'll give you a minute if you want to take pictures. And then let me do this. We talked about several different kinds of organelles in eukaryotic cells. Now, all cells, no matter what kind of cell you are surrounded by what? What surrounds all cells? Not the wall, it's the cell membrane. So, if you're a plant cell, if you're an animal cell, you both have a cell membrane. And even if you're a prokaryotic cell, a bacteria cell has a cell membrane. So if we're to draw our cells here, let me just quick. First thing we're going to see, and I'll use this is a dark spot inside both of them that contains the DNA. What is that? The nucleus. I'm going to make myself. So we've got the nucleus there. So the nucleus holds the DNA. Okay? From there, we have some parts on our plant cell that our animal cell does not have? What were the 3 things a plant cell has that an animal cell does not? Cell wall. Right, here it is. What else did it have? A central vacuole. What does the central vacuole do? Very good. So I'm going to make that blue. So it's got this big thing. That's the central vacuole. Okay. And very good. Chloroplasts. And what do chloroplasts do? Yeah. They do photosynthesis. So they look like all these little spots all around inside the cell. These are the chloroplasts. And that's very important because that's where photosynthesis happens. Okay? So then we have a bunch of other organelles as well. Now, our animal cell also does have vacuoles and little vesicles that are like little circle things, right? But it doesn't have the big central vacuole, right? But we also have inside our cell these little kind of tube-like things. And some of them had little things on top of them, okay? And those things were also sprinkled throughout the cell. And they're tiny little dots. Do you remember what those tiny dots are called? Ribosomes. What happens in the ribosomes? What do they do? What do they make? They make proteins. So this is really important. Okay? And both our plant cell and our animal cell have that. I'm going to label them both. Okay? This little tube-like thing helps with the assembly of proteins and lipids. Do you remember what it was called? And we had the rough and the smooth. The smooth ER and the rough ER. Yep, endoplasmic reticulum. We had the smooth and the rough. The only difference was the rough is covered with ribosomes. And so we also have that in our animal cell, and I'm going to just make it kind of smaller here. Okay. Let me do this, ribosome. Okay. So next we have these other things that look like little stacks, kind of like this. I'll make one over here. This is the Golgi. The Golgi apparatus. Do you remember what that does? If you're not sure, look in your notes. What does the Golgi do? There you go. It's kind of like, I told you guys, like the Amazon warehouse, you know, they're packaging things up, they're sorting them, getting ready for transport. So it modifies and sorts and then packages things for transport, okay? That's the Golgi. From there, we also have little things that help to break down the yucky stuff. And they kind of just look like little sacks as well. Do you remember the things that contain enzymes for breaking down substances? What are they called? Lysosomes. Kind of like Lysol breaks apart stuff. Lysosomes break apart the things inside the cell. From there, we also have to talk about we all need energy to live, right? Okay. So we have to have inside our cell the little piece that gives us the energy. We eat food, it gets broken down into a chemical called ATP. So this little organelle right here is where ATP is made. Mitochondria. We also call that the powerhouse of the cell. So we have that in animal cells, but we also have that in plant cells as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else we need to talk about. Cell membrane. Okay, let's talk more about the cell membrane now. Okay, so that's section 3.3 through 3.5. these? What do we call them? What do we call the little molecules that made up the cell membrane? Starts with a P.
Oh,
Phospholipid.
Phospholipids, right? And when we talk about the cell membrane, we call it the phospholipid what? Bilayer, because there's 2 layers, right? And when we talked about the cell membrane, we called it semi-permeable or selectively permeable. Why do we call it selectively permeable? Very good. So, selectively permeable means that it allows some things to pass through and keeps other things out. Okay, selectively permeable or semi-permeable. Okay. Now our phospholipids, we have 2 parts to them. They look kind of like this. We'll just make it like that. Okay, the heads and the tails. Which part is loving, water loving, the heads or the tails?
phosphate.
The phosphate, the heads. The heads we call hydrophilic because they love water. And so this is the phosphate. And then here in the middle, those are the lipid parts. And they are water hating, water fearing. So we say they're hydrophobic. Okay? Now, when we talked about how things can actually pass through the cell membrane, we said there were 2 categories, active transport and passive transport. Which type requires the use of energy from the cell? Passive or active? Active. So active requires energy, right? Like when you're being active, you're using energy. Okay, so we have active transport. And then we also had passive transport, which does not require energy. Okay, so when we were talking about these, what were some examples of passive transport? Do you remember? What were some examples of passive transport? We had 3 of them. Diffusion. And in diffusion, molecules move from where? A high concentration to a low concentration or low to high? High to low. Okay. What was the term that we used when we talked about the diffusion of water? Osmosis. That's just the diffusion of water. And then lastly, we had this term that described molecules that were a little bit bigger that had to use these transport proteins, these little tunnels to kind of pass through. What was that word? Facilitated diffusion. They just need a little help to pass through. Now, when we were talking about osmosis, we said you could put a cell into 3 types of solutions, right? We said you could put a cell into an isotonic solution. You could put a cell into a hypertonic solution or into a hypotonic solution. Okay? In a let's do this one first. Hypotonic solution. What would happen to the cell? Would it swell up or shrink down? Swell up. It swells up like a big fat O. So we have our cells swelling up. Okay. If I put it into a hypertonic solution, what's going to happen? It shrinks back down. And in isotonic, what happens to the cell? It's equal. Water's moving in and out equal. So my cell looks normal. So let me give you a real life example of hypertonic. So let's say your mouth is really, really hurting and your gums are swollen up for some reason. Okay, you have bad toothache. You decide to gargle. What does this doctor usually tell you to gargle with? Salt water, right? Well, salt water is a hypertonic solution. Okay? So what's going to happen to the water in the cells? It's going to shrink them down, right? The water's going to move out. So if you're gargling with salt water, the gums the swelling starts to go down because the water's coming out of the cells. So you're reducing swelling and inflammation that way. Yes. Hypertonic is if there's a lot of particles inside a solution and less of the particles are inside the cell, there's more water inside the cell, like when you have something swollen up, that will make your cells shrink back down. So cells shrink. So gargling salt water, hypertonic solution, it makes your cells shrink down because the water moves out of those cells. So that's how it works, like to help a sore throat or help a mouth ache or something like that. Okay, let's talk about active transport real quick. In active transport, we had some examples. We had endocytosis, and my other big one, exocytosis. Which one of these is molecules moving into the cell? Endo. So exo is molecules moving out. Okay? Now, we had a specialized form of endocytosis, was working with our immune system, that was called phagocytosis. And in phagocytosis, white blood cells will surround big nasty things like viruses, bacteria, fungus, take them inside of themselves and dissolve them up. Okay? All right, so that is the end of chapter 3. Do you guys have any questions about this stuff? Take pictures. I'm going to post a video online for you guys.